I was adopted from birth by a woman who was 70 years old. She was amazing. I grew up in Greene County, New York. Much of her family that was still living lived in Far Rockaway, Queens. Unfortunately, when I was about 12 years old, my mother became very sick. So I went to go live with my family in Far Rockaway. They took me in with open arms. They were the epitome of kindness.
Juanita grew a lot while she was here. She embraced the social work values, and she took what she learned in the classroom and applied it to problems that she found in everyday life. She has a history of helping her neighbor, of helping other people that seem in great need. And certainly the qualifications for a good social worker is someone who's compassionate about others.
Being a part of the Adelphi social work community was inspiring. I have learned so much, about community organizing and about the importance of action, especially when we see a need. It was interesting, as I was developing the Neighbors Helping Neighbors group into a nonprofit, I was in the organization class here at Adelphi. So I was literally developing the nonprofit as I was taking the class.
I think the Hudson Valley campus is a very personalized campus, and what we offer students is the opportunity to grow independently as a social worker, identifying what their interests are and pursuing those interests.
I'm going to continue my work with Hudson Valley Neighbors Helping Neighbors and moving on to perhaps working in program development, program management, and becoming a community social worker. And that's what I'm looking forward to.
Get started. Thank you all so much for being here with me today. I apologize if I'm looking both ways. I've got two devices, and so one has the chat, so I make sure I see as people join and if anyone asks any kinds of questions. And the other is for me to just present to you all and follow along with the content. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is what I'm calling from micro to macro, essentially discussion of how I leverage research, data, and social work principles to address complex social and political issues at a global scale. And so topics I'll be covered are a bit more about my story, my transition from micro practice to macro practice, some of the challenges we see at scale, specifically at a place like Twitter, getting comfortable with data, which can be a bit of a challenge, but then also the importance of things like systems thinking and relationship building in advocacy work. So with that, I'll get started. So again, the agenda, we'll cover my story. I'll talk a bit more about Twitter and kind of what we do and why we exist in the world. I'll talk about my bread and butter, which is trust and safety in the areas that I work in and how I leverage social work skills in that environment. I'll also talk about micro versus macro practice. I'll give you some definitions. I'll also provide some examples of what it actually looks like in everyday practice. I'll dive deeper into the challenges of scale and try to give you some examples for how I think about the issues we tackle and where we can have impact. I'll get on my soapbox and talk about why social workers matter in macro practice and everywhere. I think social workers should be everywhere. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then at the end, I'll leave some time for a Q&A for you to kind of ask a bit more about the topics I've discussed. Happy to share more about my story, tips and tricks for if you're interested in transitioning to macro practice or even into tech. And I'll ask that you all kind of hold your questions until the end and feel free to share them in chat and I'll answer them live. I can't see if you all are head nodding in agreement, so I'm going to assume that you all are, and I'll just move in and get started with a bit more about me. So I'm first generation college graduate. I went to Cornell University in upstate New York for undergrad. Like most students, I was pre-med when I started and realized pretty quickly that was not going to happen for me. I was not going to be a doctor. I really wanted to, and my family was really excited for me to be one, but I could do the work. I just didn't have the same kind of passion that everyone there had in the classes and that kind of stuff, especially when I got to organic chemistry. So I switched my focus to human development and human ecologies. And when I graduated in 2009, right after the economy tanked, I didn't have a job. And all of the really cool places I wanted to work for only wanted interns. They only wanted people to work for free. And Like I said, I'm first generation, come from low income family. We did not have money to throw around for free work. So ended up moving back home to work with my family in Maryland. But out of all this, I knew I was a helper. I had been helped by people my entire life, people who've gone out of their way to mentor me, to kind of coach me in trying to figure out and navigate where I want to be. How do I get through a place like Cornell? How do I map out what my life is going to be? And I wanted to give back. And so when I moved back home, I switched to social work, and I was doing direct services. Specifically, my first job was providing direct services to people with severe mental illness. And so that looked like rehabilitation coordination, medication monitoring, supporting with ADLs. So for those who don't know, activities for daily living. And then I spent a few years with DC Public School System, their Head Start program, doing community and parent engagement, specifically in low-income communities, and helping parents see how they're their child's first and most important teacher, and how they could reinforce some of their child's education at home. It was incredibly rewarding work. Some of you may recognize, if you've ever been to Maryland or DC, this image here is the Big Chair, which is in the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, DC. It's where the original Curtis Brothers furniture store was. It's still there to this day. I remember walking past it a lot and engaging with families. Oh, welcome from Kansas. Great to have you. And so while I really enjoyed the work and it was incredibly rewarding, and I'm sure you all may agree with it, I learned really quickly that the people who funded and made policy decisions and programs that impacted vulnerable populations, or the populations I cared about, those individuals never had to worry about education. They never had to worry about housing. They never had to worry about food. And I felt like there was a significant gap there. So I decided to get a master's degree in social work from University of Maryland with a focus on public policy, because I thought I was going to be that bridge between what I was seeing on the ground and more macro systems and structures. And so while finishing my master's, I worked at the Office of National Drug Control Policy for the Obama administration. I always have to say that. This was for the Obama administration years ago. And graduate school is expensive. So I knew I wanted to get the most out of it, since I was going to be in debt for the rest of my life. And what I had found out is there was actually a social worker at the White House at the time. And so I wrote her and the deputy director a plan for what I wanted to accomplish there, what I saw my value add could be, what some of the skills I had, and some of the things I definitely was interested in trying to deliver on. And they brought me in, I interviewed, and luckily enough, I became one of their graduate student policy analysts. And because it was a partnership with my school, I was able to get support in achieving my academic as well as my professional goals. And then immediately after that, I moved to California with my partner, and I worked for a year for a national nonprofit lobbying for increased access to healthcare and education for young adults. And then I got laid off, and that was sad. And so now, long story short, that's how I got to Twitter. So basically, if you had asked me a couple years ago if I'd be at Twitter, I would have told you, hell no. I didn't see myself as a tech bro. I'm not an engineer. I cannot build anything. And I actually cared about people's and their stories. Also, I had kind of built up some street cred in the organizing and social work circles here in California. And I was like, well, what are my activist peeps going to think of me going to the bad guy, to the behemoths, right? But when I actually interviewed with the teams and learned a bit more about trust and safety, which I'll talk about in a second, I found my people here. And it's actually one of the best jobs I've ever had. I get to be a policy wonk. I get to be an advocate for vulnerable groups around the world. I get to work cross-functionally with lots of different stakeholders and try to get the company to understand and prioritize issues that matter to me and my team. And it ultimately feels like my work has meaning, because I see the impacts every single day, from activists being arrested in their country and working quickly with our product managers to ensure we lock down their accounts so that governments aren't using their tweets against them in court, for example. Those are the kinds of things that we deal with on a regular basis. This feels like where I'm supposed to be, and my perspectives will help moving this organization forward. And I'll talk a bit more about how social work fits into that. And so for the people who don't know, Twitter is what's happening in the world and what people are talking about right now. If it's happening on the ground, it's happening on Twitter. Anything can spark a global conversation, and people use Twitter to share what matters to them most. They connect with like-minded individuals globally. It helps spark global movements. Think about Me Too, think about Oscar So White, Black Lives Matter, etc. And people use it to speak truth to power. They speak back to big brands, who have wronged them. They speak back to their government entity. They speak back to elected officials in their region. So just quick stats in terms of scale. Twitter has about 350 million users globally who speak 43 plus languages. The majority, I think it's about 65% of our users, are not in the United States. And we also get about 500 million tweets per day. So more tweets than I could look at, more tweets than a team of 800 people could look at. So the volume is significant, but that also means there's an opportunity for significant impact. And so a bit more about what I do. So I work with what's called a trust and safety organization. So every major social media company has a TNS team that's made up of multiple policies teams whose goal is to defend expression and keep people safe. Some of the issue areas that we cover are general safety. So that's kind of my realm. So abuse and harassment, doxing or posting private information or revenge porn, policies around sensitive media, what is graphic violence, what is pornography, what is hateful imagery, for example. We cover threats and things like that. We also have a team that works on ads policies, so teams that essentially identify what content can the company make money off of, what ads can run on certain content, what are our policies for how we target people. We're not going to target people on sensitive areas, even if we have context that they may fall in one of those groups. We also have a team that works on child safety and how to prevent exploitation specifically. And they partner with NCMEC, or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States, to kind of investigate these issues online and then work with law enforcement to investigate them offline. We also have teams of policy individuals who focus on how do we manage when governments request information on users, right? So you could imagine a government wanting to know who all the activists for a certain event are in a specific region, right? How do we determine when we hand that information over and when we don't? We have a team that does that. And last part, we have a team that kind of manages the identity pieces, so copyright and trademark as well. And what I mentioned earlier is I had no idea these companies even cared about these things or had people working on them. And when I got here, I realized immediately that, one, social workers should be doing this because we have unique skills that I'll talk about later that are super relevant, which is why I think I've been so successful in this space. But I think when we imagine people at tech companies, we definitely don't imagine people who look like me or who have my story. And I've been surprised to realize when I got here, there are a lot more people like me here than I expected, especially in the trust and safety space. And so a bit more about what I do. My role, as I said, is focused on general safety. I spend most of my time working with a global team to research and write policies. My team is based in the US. We've also got representatives in Dublin, Ireland, as well as in Singapore to cover the different time zones, as well as region-specific issues. We work on lots of cross-functional projects, which I'll talk about a bit. Nothing can be done in a vacuum as it relates to my work, especially at the scale that we operate. We also partner with some of the biggest NGOs in the world and some of the most important academics in the issues that we care about, from Harvard and Princeton and universities in the UK and all of those things, to make sure we're striking the right balance and we're getting this work right. As I mentioned, we have over 350 million users who speak 43 languages. We get one shot to write a policy that has to work for every single one of them, that also respects cultural nuance and respects the local law. So it's definitely a big lift, and I don't do it alone. So let's talk a bit more about definitions. So micropractice, as I mentioned, this is what I was doing before. Micropractice is the most common kind of social work. It's how people imagine social workers providing direct service. The social worker essentially engages with individuals and families to solve problems. Common examples are helping people find housing, healthcare and social services, as well as family therapy. Individual counseling also kind of falls under that micro practice, essentially providing treatments to individuals who are suffering or in need or are trying to move to a different place in their life or their experience. Some of the primary stakeholders are the individuals and families themselves, as well as their communities or their other care providers and practitioners. And some of the skills that are relevant for this work are all the social work skills that we know, things like active listening, right? Being able to hear what someone's saying and help kind of move them towards change. Critical thinking, right? How do you solve a complex challenge? I remember when I was working with people with severe mental illness, one of the things my mentor at the time told me is that for some of them, they're not going to get better. And so a lot of what our work is helping them get comfortable with managing the symptoms of their work and creating a new normal, right? And so it took a lot of work and critical thinking to think about, well, how do we do that? How do we help them kind of cope with what they're going to and continue to engage in their families and with all the things that matter to them? So in that work, things like boundaries become really important, as well as empathy and strong communication and organizational skills. So macro is a little bit different, right? This is more where I fit in. So the practice of macro social work is an effort to support people by intervening at a larger scale. So again, not just the individual and the family, but we're trying to empower people by involving the systems in the change. This relates to the example I was giving before about when I was doing direct services, but I felt like there was a significant gap between what we could accomplish as an organization, as individuals, if we had the right funding and resources, or if we had people shining a light on the right kinds of things. And so what does it look like at a global tech company? Essentially, a lot of it's cross-functional projects. My policies don't mean anything if we can't enforce them at scale. As I mentioned, I'm not an engineer. I can't build anything. So a lot of my work is spending getting an engineer to understand about this vulnerable group who's having a really negative experience on our platform, kind of why they should care, making my issue their issue, and then working with them to do some translation so they understand what does this look like in practice if you're going to build something. What is the technical language and specifications that we need? And that's a skill that I've had to kind of build over time. Also, one of the hallmarks of tech companies, they're incredibly fast-paced. Priorities shift quickly. We like to say that Twitter moves at the speed of conversation. And so as people are talking about things, as events are unfolding and happening in real time, we're expected to keep up with that and to always know what's going on. And so kind of coming back to the framework, our stakeholders are multiple organizations across Twitter. And so again, it's not just engineering I work closely with. I work closely with our public policy and our comms team. So how do we tell our story globally? How do we defend it in governments where truth to power or our values are not necessarily important or relevant? We rely on public policy to be there to tell that story and to engage on those issues. We also work closely with outside counsel and legal experts. Even though I know a lot about safety issues online, I do not know what it means to be a Black person in Brazil or in Japan or in Paris with a totally different social political context. And so we work with outside counsel to advise on what are the laws and expectations in those regions, as well as global experts on the issues we care about, things like child trafficking. Who are the international and national organizations that can help us with that? Who are the international organizations that help us think about what bullying looks like online and the offline consequences? So it's not just how we deal with it, but how do we also educate people about the impact of their words online? And the last part, which I think is the most exciting part about being at Twitter specifically, is we work with our users, right? We're lucky enough that we get real-time feedback in any moment. We launch a new policy, it's in the news, our users tell us if it sucks. They tell us that they love it. They tell us if we should move on. And that's really good because we're getting that feedback and we can iterate and switch as needed. One of the things I laugh about with friends is people will mention Jack or they'll mention someone and say, hey, this is a problem. We read all of that stuff, right? Especially my team. If you mention Jack, there's a really good chance he's going to text it to me and say, hey, what's going on here? Or he'll text it to our VP and she'll share it with the team for review. We are always engaged in that. And that's what makes working at Twitter so electric, but also so human. We're always thinking about the people behind these things. And so while the stakeholders are different in macro practice for me, a lot of the skills are exactly the same. We are still using empathy, right? How do I understand what's happening to this person who I've never met, who I don't know their story, who's writing into us because something's wrong, or who's sharing their opinion on the platform? We saw that a lot with the Me Too movement. People were being very vulnerable on our platform, sharing things that were so tough and difficult. And so for me, it's kind of empathizing with them while also defending their right to share it, especially when they're difficult messages, especially when they're allegations that may or may not be true, creating a space where people can still do that. Also, the organizational skills still matter, kind of keeping track of projects and records. We do a lot of that here at Twitter, as well as communication, effective communication about our stance on issues, why we make the decisions that we make, and how we communicate with other stakeholders. Some of the other separate things that I'll go to later in the talk are things like systems thinking. So again, we're not just thinking about how does it impact this one issue, how do we impact this one issue, but how do we scale it for every other person who has a phone that's using Twitter or other platforms? Relationship building too, getting my issue to be an issue that someone else cares about. And interestingly enough, and similar to some of the social work spaces I worked in before, you never feel like you have enough resources, right? Even at a global tech company. And so for a lot of the things that I've proposed, I'll get the response that, oh, we don't really have enough money for that, or we won't for a few more months. And that's when relationships matter, being able to leverage resources from other teams to accomplish goals, as well as figuring out what a timeline could look like and iterate in small chunks to have impact. The other one is research and data. I'll talk a bit more about that. I've always not been a fan of data. I hated data when I was taking the courses at University of Maryland. I was like, evidence-based practice, like I just want to help people. I totally don't care. But as I'll talk about later, data is in everything that I do, and it's super, super important. And so I had to get comfortable with data. And I encourage others who feel the same way that I used to feel to try to get really comfortable with it. Data is how you get funding for your work. Data is also a great tool for convincing others to have impact, but then or to care about your issue. But also data is great for knowing if you're having the impact. I have a t-shirt that says good intentions are not enough, right? We can start with good intentions, but we also got to know that we are having the impact that we hope to see. And the last one I always plug is translation, right? I think social workers do this a lot. The conversation that you have with your client about access to food stamps or healthcare is very different than what the Affordable Care Act says, for example, but it's not our expectation that a client will know what all 172 pages of the Affordable Care Act are. We have to do translation there. What does this actually mean for you in your moment? And then when we're talking to their practitioner, we provide different language. We're talking about the same issue in a different way, in a way that resonates with the practitioner or care provider. And the same thing, if you're talking to a family member of them, you translate the information so that it matters and is relevant to that audience. We do a lot of that every day in macro practice too, in order to be impactful. So let's talk a bit more about systems thinking. I'm sure those of you who have MSWs or just working in the space have heard of systems thinking before. I really like this picture because I think about this is what the work looks like for us at scale. So essentially the definition is systems thinking is focused on embracing the interconnectedness and complexity of various parts of a system. Like most things, the issues I care about cannot be solved in a disciplinary silo. So for example, I mentioned that my beautifully written and well-articulated policies don't mean anything if they can't be enforced. And so while I may whenever I encounter an issue, I am thinking about what tools do we need in order to enforce this at scale? What kinds of information and context do we need for us to get it right most often, especially when you change the characters, right? How do we tell this story? Is this a story we can even tell? Is this something we've ever defended externally? And what kind of external communication do we have? How do we track metrics? How do we track that the project's on track to launch to a global scale? And all of these different parts of the systems impact the user's experience. And I think when I first joined Twitter, I was like, okay, it's a timeline, it's words on a page. There can't be that many people who do this. But globally, we have about 3,700 employees who help make Twitter what it is. And most of that is engineering. And again, they're a big stakeholder for us, but we also have every other organization that any business has. We have lots of sales people, we have lots of partnerships people, we have people who do HR, we have legal teams, we have policy teams like mine, we have people who do internal communications, we have people who just manage wellness. Do people feel like they're included? Do we have a diverse workforce? All of those things are there too. And I encourage people who are thinking about tech to really expand the horizon and explore the lots of different opportunities at these big companies, because it's not just engineers at a desk. And so for me, related to systems thinking, it's about identifying where I fit into this process and how do I create value. And so in most cases, it's providing policy expertise and guidance on a really complex issue. As I mentioned, Twitter moves at the speed of conversation. There have been lots of times where we encountered a situation where there's no right answer to it, right? There are things that may feel right morally, but if we can't be transparent around them, our morals really don't matter because people are going to speculate, right? There are things that are important for us to do, but if we don't have the tool that actually removes the content or keeps it up or emphasizes it or hides it or whatever, then we're kind of stuck. And so figuring out what your value add in the system is really important instead of getting subsumed and overwhelmed by it, if that makes sense. And let's talk about scale too. This is something else I had to really learn as I was doing the job. There's always challenges of scaling efforts. We talked about a few earlier, right? So how do you make something work in one context as opposed to another context in a totally different part of the world? Oh, I saw we got a great question. I'll definitely answer that one. Thank you so much, Lisa. And so it's one thing to work with an individual or a family. It's another to try to create a program or policy that works for millions of people. As I mentioned previously, the social work skills are similar, but some of the things I've had to always really work at are thinking bigger, right? For me, I'm really invested in being a helper. I really care about the individual's experience, but because of time and scale, we don't really have the luxury of sitting with individuals and helping them see through an issue. We have to always be thinking about how we leverage data and feedback from our global stakeholders to help us better understand what an issue looks like at 10,000 feet as opposed to, right in the moment. And I think a really great example of that is most policies at these tech companies assume everyone is healthy from a mental standpoint, right? But as social workers, we know health is a spectrum, right? And so what I think about a lot are what about our users who are depressed or our users who are having suicidal ideation, right, on our platform? We should not be punishing them. Our response to them should be resources. We should be reaching out to them with things that are localized in their region so that they know there is help and that people care about them. And that's a way that I think about some of the challenges at scale, but also putting a perspective from a social work lens on how we do this work in a more meaningful and impactful way. And at scale, what that looks like is having a response that can be localized, but they can be shipped to anybody who we get a report for who is experiencing these issues. And then also for individuals globally who are looking for this content on our platform, the first content they see is something from us. That's like, there is help, we can help you. And engineers and our public policy team helped us partner with NGOs so that we have phone numbers for every major market that we work in order to address it. And related to that, other things I had to really think a lot about is collaboration. As I mentioned, I'm first-gen college student. A-type personality, A+, do it on my own. I didn't really like group work for a long time. I wanted to shine. I wanted to have impact and be able to say, I did this, I accomplished something. But at scale, nothing happens in a silo, so we spend a lot of time collaborating. On the example that I provided you earlier, while I was able to share the framework and guide the process of getting us to a place where we're supporting people who are really struggling on the platform, I needed to work with so many different stakeholders across the globe to get that across the finish line. And again, resources is always an important part too. If you're not collaborating, you may not get the resources and support you need to have the impact that you want. And the last thing I'll share related to the challenges of scale is being really comfortable with iteration. As I mentioned, I like to see results and I want to know that I'm having impact and that I'm helping. But at scale, things take time, right? And we see lots of content on the platform in the news, and I'll get pings from friends who are just like, hey, that looks really bad. Like, you all are really messing up. What I'm able to sleep well at night because I know what's coming. I know where we're starting. I know that we've got a vision for where we're going. I know that the company is invested in my issues. I wouldn't still be here if they weren't. And I'm excited for what's to come. And when we're transparent and when we're over this edge of this one issue, and I've seen it a lot. Sometimes it does take a few quarters, or people who don't work in the quarter schedule, it's usually every 3 months we consider a quarter. Sometimes it takes a few quarters for us to see some of the fruits of our labor. Sometimes in a few cases, some of the policies that are written, it's taken over a year before we actually start, or users actually start to see the impact of our work. And so it's kind of getting comfortable with that iteration and then also that steady measurement. And we'll talk about this in the data section, but a lot of times if we created metrics and we see that we're not moving in that direction and we're not getting the impact that we want, we switch and we pivot. Twitter is really good about changing direction and moving people from one organization to another so that we're actually getting closer to what we want. So those things are things I've had to kind of get comfortable with and learn. So this is the last area I want to talk about before I provide my talk on why social work matters in this space and then kind of wrap up for questions. I had to get comfortable with data. I hated data, and I think for me it was because it was intimidating. I wasn't really good at SQL or spreadsheets and all of those things, and I also didn't get why it mattered so much, because at the time when I was in graduate school, the nonprofits I was working at, the government agencies I was aligned with, the experts were there, the institutional knowledge was there. I was like, these people know how to have the impact. But I think something I've seen in tech is as the environment changes, we're not always going to have the right answers. And some of the tools that have worked for us historically aren't going to continue to work. And that's where data matters. And data is in everything I do, as I mentioned. It's a way that I get others to care about the issues that I care about. It's how I show the impact of my work and my team. It's how we define the scope of a problem and the best way to intervene at a macro level. There are hundreds of ways you can intervene, and we use data to decide which one is the right one. It's also, again, how we determine whether or not we should stop or keep going on certain things. We may start with good intentions, we may have data, but if the environment shifts or the conversation shifts or the political climate shifts or there's a natural disaster, right? All of those things impact our project or program, and we need to pivot and collect more information. As I mentioned, when it comes to complex challenges, good intentions really aren't enough. You've always got to be thinking about what your expected outputs are, as well as the long-term outcomes. So for example, in our work, the things that we measure as it relates to our safety policies could be something like, well, how often do people see abuse on the platform, right? And what are our metrics related to that? How many reports do we get? Do we get reports from the people who are being targeted, or do we get reports from people who are witnessing? And then how does that impact our project and approach? What are people's understanding of our policy? This is something I took for granted a lot before I got here. Most people who have a Twitter account or Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or Snapchat, whatever, never read the terms of service. I know I didn't. And also there's studies that show that you wouldn't even have time to read all the terms of service in your lifetime for all the things you kind of agree to by just having an iPhone, right? And so we know that most of our users do not know what our policies are, and they usually don't find out until they violate them, and that's too late, right? So we're always looking at metrics around that. And then also, do people change their behaviors, right? When we intervene and we say stop or don't do something, what data do we show that actually changes things? And if it's not changing their behavior, we should probably be doing some other kind of intervention, right? And we kind of measure those things a lot along the way. So data really, really matters for us. And so to kind of wrap it up for me, why social workers matter in macro practice. I remember when I was getting my MSW at University of Maryland, there were not many students who cared about macro practice. And this isn't a bad thing at all. I think for me, I had no idea, again, that there was opportunities for us to leverage our skills in this way. I just remembered it being really isolating because there were like 3 other students in my cohort who were interested in macro work. And it was great being able to learn from them, but it was awesome trying to find out who else around the country was interested in this work so we could learn and share best practices. And I credit a lot of my success at Twitter to my MSW, from the skills and training and experiences that I learned in doing direct services and working with some of the big organizations that I work with and having some of the mentors I had. Also, the resilience that I've developed, I think, in some of the faces of really complex challenges, right? Some of the things I was doing with families or people with severe mental illness or with seniors, those are legitimate challenges. Those things are hard, right? It impacts people's lives directly, whether or not they get access to services or whether or not they are able to cope with their mental illness. And I think working through those things really helped prepare me for some of the challenges in this environment where I see some of my colleagues encounter a global challenge and they crumble, right? Or they panic. And for my team and for me, we run towards the fire because we've always had to do that. We sit in that place of discomfort and we lean in, as some of my favorite social workers say in their books. And that all comes from my MSW and my experience. And those things have been recognized in this environment and kind of set me apart. And so one of my mentors used to always say, you don't know what you don't know. Before I got to Twitter, I didn't know much about this work and what was there, but I was surprised to see how many of my skills resonate in this space and how translatable they are and how celebrated they are too, because lots of people don't have our perspective. I don't think macro practice is for everyone, but I do think social workers belong everywhere, right? Not just in the traditional sense. And as I mentioned, with the speed of how technology is moving, the world is increasingly becoming more complex, and there's lots of ethical questions that are wrapped up in this that need to be addressed in an increasingly interconnected world. And I feel like if any group of professionals are prepared to tackle these challenges, it's definitely social workers. So that's it for me, and I'm happy to take Q&A. I've got one in here from Lisa that I'll answer first, and I'll read it out loud in case people aren't looking at the chat. Lisa says, I'm in the process of applying for several non-traditional positions for which I believe my social work skills will bring value to these spheres. How did you go about making the case for yourself and your abilities? So for me, it came down to translation, right? As I mentioned, the skills that matter, things like organizational skills, communication skills, I made sure, and relationship building, I made sure those things were prominent in my resume, because my concern and the feedback I actually got when I started applying for jobs outside of micro practice was that even though you helped 75 families increase their understanding of early childhood education in DC, a recruiter in a policy organization or a government organization may not know what that means. And so if we take that example of helping 75 families change their understanding, in order to do that, I had to be a relationship builder, right? I had to be a strong communicator. I had to be someone who's empathetic. I had to be someone who's organized. And what I would do is I would focus on shifting your language to talk about your skills in that way, because no one's going to say, oh, we don't want someone on our team who's a good relationship builder, right? No one's going to say, we don't want someone on our team who is a go-getter, who takes on complex challenges and is comfortable delivering results when there's ambiguity. Like everyone for any kind of job is going to say that's the person they want on their team. It's the translation piece of making sure that comes through in your application materials and in your interview, because a lot of the skills are generalizable. And I think when I started talking about my skills in that way, that's when people got really receptive. And then I support those with the examples, right? So I say I'm organized, and here's how I mapped out, or here's a power map that I created of DC in terms of who the influencers are as it relates to whether or not people get access to the housing resources that are provided, right? That's me being organized. That's me being detailed oriented. It's me being a communicator and taking a complex challenge and creating a pathway. So Lisa, I would encourage you to think about those things. How do you really pull at the kernel of what the skills are that are required in the work that you've done, and then make sure you allow that to shine and highlight in your resume and in interviews. Happy to talk more about that. What are some other examples of macro practice? And so I think traditionally the examples have been government work. And so there's social workers who work for big government agencies who are providing lots of services for different people or lots of different programs. I encounter lots of social workers doing advocacy work or even lobbying. So the job I had before I joined Twitter was a national nonprofit that worked to help young adults get access to higher education and healthcare. I spent half of my time in the office in San Francisco writing policies, evaluating policies, meeting with nonprofit stakeholders so we can get alignment on how do we actually move some of the levers. And then the other half was in Sacramento, actually meeting with legislators and saying, here is this issue that people are facing in your region. This is why you should care about it. And so that meant creating things like fact sheets. That meant doing that translation piece, right? So their policy on healthcare really impacts undocumented individuals in this specific way, and having to advocate and explain why they should care about this issue, and then what we hope that they will do to change. It's like the nonprofit advocacy space is another example of macro practice. Just the government space is macro practice. Or I think for individuals who currently work at an organization that is dedicated to micro, as you think about how you move up in the ranks, right? So it's one thing to be a practitioner, it's another to be like a manager or a director or a global head. I think in those instances, it becomes a lot more about macro practice skill as opposed to just direct services too, if that helps answer your question. Cool. And so Christine said, I'm a macro practitioner. One of the issues I constantly see is that people in the private sector and other sectors do not understand what social workers do. They see our education and they run away because they think we take kids out of homes. Christine, that is so true. A lot of people who I talk to, especially in the Bay Area, are like social workers are only child services, and that is it. And it is not the case. And so for me, it helped with sharing my story. And so similar to the response I gave to Lisa, it takes us trying to translate what are the kernels of skills that we have in our resume. So it's not just even if you work in child protective services, there are skills related to that matter in lots of different spaces, right? Thinking about how challenging that work is. So resilience is something that's super important that should shine in conversations and in your resumes and cover letter. Organizational. I remember in social work, we had so many documents and folders and case files, and you always have more case files than you even have time to review. You always have more clients than you even have time to engage in a meaningful way. And so organizational skills are incredibly important. And so if I were in an interview or meeting with someone to talk about my work, I would say, yes, I'm a child social worker in New York, for example. One of the skills that I bring that's important to this job is I have incredible attention to detail and organization. I have this caseload of 300 families who I have to see and engage with to help that they are achieving their goals. The way I do this is I keep charts, I keep records, I keep them maintained, I keep them updated. And my understanding of this current role is that it will require me to bring that same kind of attention to the work, right? That's kind of how I talked about my work. And I would use the most obscure, most challenging examples to kind of catch people off guard on purpose, especially on the interview on Twitter. I love to talk about my time working with people with severe mental illness, not because I want to exploit their stories or their experience, but because I want people to know that social workers are doing some of the hardest work. And we're doing it without a lot of pay. We're doing it without a lot of recognition. And especially in the trust and safety space, as I mentioned, most people don't know that we exist. Most people don't know that we're fighting on behalf of youth who are being exploited. So it's thankless, right? And I wanted them to see that my social work experience is not very different than what they experience here, or the fact that we're constantly fighting for resources. And so in order to get the resources we need, we leverage relationships, we leverage data. All of those things I think are great ways to sell your social work background and experience to an organization. Cool. Did that answer your question, Christine? Cool. We've got a bit more time. Happy to answer any other questions that people have. I can talk about this work for forever. As I mentioned, I really enjoy it. And again, I was surprised at how much of the skills I've gathered in my MSW are really transferable and are celebrated here. And so I'll encourage others who are thinking about making the transition to explore it, but also to reach out, right? I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm happy to have a coffee if you're ever in San Francisco, right? Or just to answer over email as well if you have additional questions. And Christine reached out about contacting me for a blog. Yes, reach out to me. I would love to help. I don't want, in the same way I don't want my work to be in a silo, I don't think my story is unique. There are lots of people out there doing really meaningful work, and there are lots of ways to apply the skills that you have. So I'm happy to share. All right, I'll continue to hang around for a few minutes in case any other questions come in. But before people jump off, I just want to say thank you for kind of listening. Thank you for your attentiveness. I saw lots of people with the questions as I was going through, and I really appreciate it. As I mentioned, I really care passionately about social work and my MSW. I do wear my MSW as a badge of honor. I tell everyone that I have it. I'm really proud of it, and it's something I carry with me in my work. And if my story or if my information can help others in any way, I'm happy to do so. So we have a question from Andy. What advice do you have for graduating social workers? And so if you were like me, I had a ton of student loan debt when I was graduating. So the job was the number one priority for me. I think if you are looking to join an organization or even like a non-traditional role or a macro practice, I would say leverage technology, right? I know a lot of professionals are on LinkedIn, but I would say LinkedIn is your friend, especially if you want to work in tech company or for some of the big international nonprofits. It's incredibly competitive. I interview candidates all of the time. And when I tell people who are looking to get into a company, I tell them to think about the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who apply are qualified. They went to a great school. They had good internships, right? Like what sets you apart from them? In lots of places, especially in nonprofits, it's the story. Like how connected are you to the work can set you apart from someone else who's got the same skills and experience. At a tech company, it's the connection to the work or the platform, right? Sometimes that means avid users, or in my case, it meant someone who didn't use the platform. And I found out the reason why I didn't have a Twitter account was for trust and safety reasons. I didn't trust Twitter with my data. I had grown up putting my whole life story on Facebook. I'm like, what did it get me except for fear that someone's going to exploit my passwords and that kind of stuff, right? And so I would say leverage your resources for that. And so again, when you assume that everyone's got great experience, that now when people can apply for jobs at the click of a button, I mean, we posted a job a week ago, and within an hour, there were 12,000 applicants globally, right? And so, of course, I can't read 12,000 resumes. We tried. We've got systems and tools that help, but clearly, I'm not going to get through all of them. What can be useful for you is contacting people on the team to find out what they're actually looking for, right? My experience was that sometimes I found this great job, and then I called up a friend who works there, and they're like, actually, this job is promised to someone else who already works here. I'm like, well, that's good to know. Before I spend hours on my cover letter, I'm not going to apply for that one. Or you find out, actually, this job is really for someone who speaks Turkish, so they're not looking for you. So I would leverage your network. Or what's even better is on LinkedIn, you can find out who the recruiters are, right? It's public information. If you go to a company page like Twitter, click on people, type in recruiter, you will see all the recruiters who work at Twitter. It does not hurt to send them a cold message to say like, hey, I'm so-and-so. I have my MSW. Here are some of the skills that I bring. It looks like you've got an opening here. Would love to talk more about how I could fit in your company. Please see my resume attached. Regards, Jarrell, right? Sometimes you won't get a response, but all you really need is that one or two people to bite and be excited. And that's how you get opportunities, right? That's how you get in the door. So if you're in front of a recruiter who's got 12,000 applications, you want them to say, oh, Jarrell reached out on LinkedIn. Maybe I should consider Jarrell for this, if that's helpful. Cool. Great, Andy. I hope that helps. Lisa, you said you're a housing counselor that works with a team of 4 full-time employees who serve 1,100 individuals and families in 2018. Can you speak more to your experience making sure that you are still being empathetic and responsive to the needs of your users? Burnout happened to her in 2 years. I'm looking to be able to serve larger groups of people in a macro setting and would like some information on avoiding this pitfall. Thanks in advance. So it's super important to stay close to the work, right? And so for my team, we see what we call escalations, right? And so it's our job to write the policy, but because of the way that conversations move and environments change, there are always gray areas and gaps. So something we thought we knew a lot about changes overnight. And so those escalations kind of keep me close to the issues. But also what I do is I spend a lot of time with my teams that are in the queue. So when you report a tweet, it does not come to me. It does not go to my phone. I don't get a little text message that's like, hey, someone reported a safety issue on Twitter. It goes to a team of agents globally who are trained in our work. And once a month, I spend time with them kind of looking at what are some of the new trends that we are seeing. What are some of the cases that you're unsure about? Or what are some of the reasons why people are violating our rules? Because the overwhelming majority of our users are healthy. They go through what we call episodes of abuse. And so they have an issue on our platform, not because they're a bad person, but because something happened and we want to engage them there. So staying close to the work helps me. related to burnout, we have systems built in place that I borrowed directly from my experience in social work. And so we worked with our HR teams to get healthcare professionals embedded. So our team meets as a group and we do group therapy with individuals because of some of the sensitive content and emotionally charged things that we see. You also can sign up anonymously to meet with a therapist on staff. For organizations that don't have that, I think self-care is incredibly important, that you should work with your manager to prioritize it. So for example, when someone's working a long shift or a weekend, it's already built into our system that they get the next day as a work from home or even the next day as off. And what they have to do is actually opt out of the additional time off. It literally closes their calendar, it mutes all of their notifications and their email on their phone and all of their apps so that they can take this time to kind of recover and recuperate. Even if that means they're going to sit on the couch, we still want to make sure that they're doing something for them as opposed to doing something for us specifically. And that's just one example of how we try to build self-care into our work. We're also no judgment too. If you've got to take things for yourself, we allow people to do those things without feeling like they're not a high performer or that we're judging them for wanting to care for themselves or their families. I hope that was helpful. It looks like I'm out of time. Thank you again, everyone, for your attentiveness and for your questions. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any others, and hopefully we encounter paths soon. Take care, everyone.